Today, I'm going to share 3 stories that are all about people who went to great lengths to make themselves look good. But in each case, as you'll see, it completely backfires. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is really excited to see a new movie, make sure you tell them the ending of that movie right as they're sitting down to watch it. Okay, let's get into our first story. One afternoon in late February of 2023, a 26-year-old man named Julio Bermejo walked toward a park in the city of Puno, Peru, with his girlfriend, Juanita. They were on the way to the park to meet Julio's 2 best friends, who he was finally going to be introducing Juanita to. To this point, they knew he had a girlfriend, but they had never actually met. And this, in and of itself, was actually kind of odd, because again, these are Julio's best friends, and Julio and Juanita had actually been together for a while now. But Julio had sort of always been a little hesitant to introduce her to his friends, because he knew, Juanita was just a little bit different. She was odd. And he knew that his friends might, pick up on that and maybe even make fun of him for it. He didn't know. He was worried that it would cause weirdness amongst the friends if they, had a chance to interact with his girlfriend. And so he just kind of kept her secret. But his friends knew he was dating Juanita, and they just really wanted to meet her. And so they kept pressuring him. And finally, he's like, you know what? We'll just go to the park. We'll meet up. I'm sure it'll be fine. And in order to ensure that this meeting would go as well as it could, Julio had also brought along with him as they're walking to the park, he had this big red cooler. And inside of it was all this rum and some cups and ice and stuff that they could drink while they're at the park. And for what it's worth, you're not allowed to drink in public in Peru. And Julio knew this. And so he was sort of weary of the fact that he's lugging this, obvious case of drinks out to a public park. And he was going to be drinking in public, but he felt like it was worth the risk. He would go out there, they'd have a couple of drinks, his friends would meet Juanita, it would all be fine. Eventually, Julio and Juanita reached the edge of the park. And up ahead, Julio could see his 2 friends waiting by this crumbling wall within the park. So most of Puno was covered in all these old ruins because there was this ancient civilization called the Incas who had lived there hundreds of years ago. And so this crumbling wall that his friends were sitting on was quite literally like an artifact, a remnant of the past. But it was sort of so commonplace in this area that people didn't even notice them. It was just sort of part of the landscape. And so Juanita and Julio and Julio's big red cooler full of rum, they lumbered their way through the park, dodging different, ruins that were jutting out of the ground, all the way over to the wall where the 2 friends were. And they actually hadn't seen them approaching. And so it was only when they kind of just were standing right in front of them that the friends looked and saw Julio, saw Juanita. And Julio, right away, he's sort of trying to gauge their reaction to Juanita and to this whole situation. But pretty quickly, his friends were, just pretty cool. And they were interested in Juanita. And, they quickly wanted to learn more about Juanita. And it was just like kind of easy. And Julio, he opened up the cooler right away. He got the cups out. He's filling them up with rum and soda. And all the friends are drinking. They're having a good time. And Julio's like, man, I was worried about nothing. My friends, they think Juanita is great. Yeah, she's different, but they think she's great. This has gone as well as it could have. And also, definitely the rum was helping. And so for a while, all 4 of them were just sitting around this, crumbling wall, drinking their rum. They're having a good time. And then at some point, Julio, who was facing his 2 friends, his friends, they sort of looked up and they had this look come over their face like they were worried about something that clearly was behind Julio. They sort of gasped when they saw it. And Julio, he's like, oh no, like, is it the police? Because they're out here drinking publicly and they're getting a little bit drunk and a little bit rowdy, with the exception of Juanita. She had drank the least of the group, perhaps to maintain some level of decency, perhaps. But, the 2 friends and Julio, they were pretty drunk and being loud. And so Julio, he turns around and his stomach just drops because, yep, here come the police. There are 2 officers coming over and he's thinking, the jig's up. They're going to clearly see that we are drinking in public. We can't even hide it. And so the officers, they walk over and, the friends are sort of panicking. They're putting their cups down. And Julio, he's just sort of resigned to his fate here. He's going to get in trouble. And the officers that come over and they see the cups and they can clearly tell this group of people is drinking. But when they looked into that red cooler, that big red cooler that Julio had brought along, when they saw what was in there, they backed up and they told Julio to stay right where he was. So Julio and Juanita had actually been together for years. And despite his insecurities about her, about their relationship, he was ultimately pretty eager for his friends to finally meet her. But taking her to the park that day turned out to be a really big mistake. Because when the police arrived on the scene and they looked in Julio's red cooler, probably expecting to see alcohol, because that's very likely why they approached them in the first place, they did see alcohol, but they also saw Juanita. So Julio was right to be on edge about how his friends might react to seeing his girlfriend, seeing Juanita, because she was so different, right? That's his concern. And she was very different than your sort of average girlfriend, let's say. Because Juanita was actually an 800-year-old mummified man from the pre-Hispanic era, the period when the Incan civilization ruled the area. Julio's father had acquired Juanita, this mummy, decades ago. So Juanita had actually been a fixture in Julio's life since he was born. Now, Julio's best friends, really all of his friends, knew that, his family had this mummy, but they didn't take it seriously when Julio referred to the mummy as his girlfriend. Again, this is an 800-year-old mummified man, that he calls his girlfriend. They thought it was a joke. But, when it seemed like it wasn't a joke, when it seemed like Julio apparently had a real relationship with this mummy, the friends begged him to bring Juanita out. They wanted to see this amazing artifact. But they didn't realize that request, when they finally pushed Julio to come out to this park with Juanita in his cooler, because that's how he transported her, that would actually destroy their friend's actual love life. Because Julio was not joking when he called Juanita his girlfriend. He had very real, very deep feelings for this mummy. He'd even convinced himself that she was like an active participant in their relationship and sort of kept him in line, according to Julio. He said that Juanita would hold his hand and would poke his feet whenever he misbehaved. And so when those two officers in the park came over to Julio and his friends and they looked in the cooler, they saw, Juanita, this mummy, partially inside of this cooler along with the rum. And so right off the bat, Julio and his friends, they're getting in trouble for that alcohol. But also, Julio was arrested and charged with the illegal possession of a historical item. But as of 2023, there's been no update on this case. As for Juanita, like the actual mummy, it was confiscated by the Ministry of Culture for research purposes. And that means very likely that she and Julio will be separated forever. Our next story is called Unit 85. One afternoon in 1984, a man named Dmitry carried a cardboard box down the hallway of this high-rise apartment building in the city of Kramatorsk, Ukraine. And this building was basically brand new. It was one of a bunch of developments that had been built right before the Moscow Olympics just 4 years earlier in 1980 as part of a push to show the world that the Soviet Union was a very successful and prosperous place. So very much by design, everything that they had built was very shiny and very modern and impressive, like this apartment building. And pretty much everybody in the area had been really desperate to get one of these new apartments, and Dmitry had lucked out. So a few weeks ago, Dmitry had been notified that one of the units had suddenly opened up, and he jumped at the opportunity to move in. He and his family had never lived in a place this nice before. I mean, there were brand new appliances, and the building had thick concrete walls with great soundproofing, so they didn't have to listen to their neighbors chat or watch TV like they had in many other places they lived before. Like, this was a huge upgrade. So today, Dmitry and his wife and two sons had basically spent the entire afternoon hauling their furniture in and getting situated because they're like, we want to move in here as fast as possible. His family was inside the unit now, unpacking basically everything else, and Dmitry was bringing up one of the very last boxes. But as he headed down the hallway toward his apartment, Unit 85, he saw a neighbor open up her door right up ahead, and the neighbor looked out at him. And as Dmitry got closer to this neighbor, he noticed that this woman looked incredibly sad and just kind of tired, like life had beaten her down. She was also really pale and very thin and gaunt, and she had bags under her eyes. And she was watching Dmitri with this strange expression on her face, almost like pity for Dmitri. And Dmitri, despite this initial reaction to what she looked like, he doesn't know her, and this is his neighbor after all, so he was about to stop and introduce himself to her, but right as he was about to, she suddenly went back inside of her unit and closed the door. The whole thing was just very weird. And Dmitri, after the door had shut, he just stood there for a second, wondering if he should knock and ask the woman if there was some kind of problem, like was she okay? But in general, Dmitri was naturally kind of a quiet, introverted guy, and he very much preferred to mind his own business about pretty much everything. So he decided he would just leave the woman alone, which was pretty clearly what she wanted anyways. I mean, she's the one who shut the door and disappeared on him. So after a minute, he just walked the rest of the way down the hallway, he went inside of his unit, and he carried this cardboard box that he had lugged up here into the bedroom that his teenage sons were going to share. And when he got in there, he saw his boys were standing up on one of the mattresses, trying to hang a decorative rug on the wall behind their beds to kind of, freshen up the place. And Dmitri, he was glad to see that. It seemed like his sons were, leaning in to making this space their own. And so Dmitri, he set the box down and looked around their room. And with all their stuff there, it was already starting to feel like home. And he was sure that, despite the weirdness with his neighbor, that this has got to be the beginning of a really just amazing, new exciting chapter for he and his family. But Dmitri quickly realized that not everything in this building was as amazing as he thought it was. I mean, he'd already had that weird run-in with his neighbor, and it would turn out that was just the tip of the iceberg. Even though, his apartment and this whole building was undeniably nice and beautiful and modern, basically all of their neighbors were not nice. It was not just that one woman who appeared to be quite rude on that first day there. It was like every single person Dmitri ran into in this entire complex was quiet and sullen and grumpy and definitely not interested in talking to Dmitri. And then more than that, you have all these people that clearly didn't want anything to do with Dmitri and his family, but it was almost like all the time, the entire place was just silent. I mean, there was good soundproofing in this building, no doubt, but every time he walked down the hallway, it was just silent. Like nobody was making any noise in any of the apartment buildings. It was like this weird vibe that sort of hung over this whole place, like a sense of gloom and doom sort of persisted everywhere. And Dmitri just couldn't explain it. Like of all places to have that feeling be so present, why here? This is such a nice place. But Dmitri and his family, they stuck it out. They stayed in this apartment. And, despite how weird, it was, and it continued to be as weird as I've described here, pretty much the whole time they were there, Dmitri and his family, they tried to make the best of it. But a couple of years after they had moved into Unit 85, Dmitri's older son started feeling unusually tired and weak, sort of similar to how the people in the building all seemed to act. And at first, Dmitri thought his son was just stressed with school or his social life or something, and maybe he just needed more sleep. But his son's symptoms just kept getting worse. And when Dmitri and his wife eventually took their son to the doctor, they found out that unfortunately their son had leukemia, which is a blood cancer. Now, this was obviously a total shock to the family because, this whole time they'd been chalking it up to, he needs more sleep, right? But to find out it was something so serious, they didn't even know what to think. And on top of that, Dmitri's son, who had the leukemia, he had always been like a really active, healthy kid. So this just felt like it came out of nowhere. But now he had to undergo cancer treatment and spend most of his time resting in bed. And despite doing those things, he just continued to get worse. A few months after Dmitri's older son got sick, Dmitri was sitting inside of an exam room at the doctor's office with his younger son, who was now also sick. He had a lot of the same symptoms as his brother, so Dmitri had taken him for blood tests right away, fearing, he could have leukemia too. So now they were waiting for the doctor to come back with those blood test results to see if that was the case. And when the doctor did finally come back into the room, Dmitri could tell by the look on the doctor's face that whatever they were going to say was going to be bad. And so the doctor, he sat down and said that Dmitri's younger son did also have leukemia. Dmitri was shattered. He was in complete disbelief here. He asked the doctor, like, how is it possible that both of my children could develop the same type of cancer in the same year? And the doctor said, well, there is an answer for that. This was hereditary. The whole family had a genetic predisposition to leukemia. That afternoon, Dmitry brought his youngest son home and told his wife and his older son the terrible news. And Dmitry just couldn't help but feel incredibly guilty, like this was all his fault for passing his bad genes onto his kids. So once, everybody had begun to process the news and the sons were both in bed, Dmitry, just who didn't know what to do with himself now, he felt so terrible, he just decided to go out for a walk to clear his head. And so he did that. He went out, he walked around, and it didn't really work. He still had so much on his mind, so many bad thoughts passing through his mind. But when he got back to the building after his walk, as he approached the main entrance, he saw one of his neighbors sitting out on the steps, smoking a cigarette. It was actually that woman that he had first seen when he had moved in, the one who had poked her head into the hallway and then quickly closed the door without saying hello. Since that day, Dmitry had never spoken to her. He hadn't even tried to talk to her. Like, it was clear she didn't want anything to do with him or anyone else for that matter. And certainly tonight was not the moment he was going to go, talk to this woman. But very much to his surprise, as Dmitry, walked right past her and began walking up the steps to go inside the building, she actually turned and looked at him and just asked him, is everything okay? And Dmitry was so caught off guard by this that he found himself just suddenly, very emotionally, sort of blurting out everything about his son's illnesses and how it was all his fault. And as his neighbor listened to him, she didn't seem surprised at all by what he was saying. And when he was done talking, she didn't ask a single question about it. In fact, she just nodded her head like, yep, that's too bad, as if she knew this was already going on, even though there was no way she could have known this stuff. And so when it was clear their conversation wasn't really going to go much further than Dmitry just sort of vomiting out all this information and her nodding, and that was sort of it, Dmitry was going to go back into the building, but she stopped him. And she did ask him a question. She asked him, do you know anything about the tenants who lived in your unit before you? He said no. All he knew is that somebody had lived there, and then apparently they had left. That created the opening and he had jumped at the chance to move in. That's all he knew. And so she told him that, well, actually there's a story behind why this cleared up, why that unit cleared up. She said the previous tenants were a mother and her 2 teenage kids. And they had all died within 2 years of moving in. That's why it opened up. And they had died from leukemia. After hearing this, Dmitry couldn't help but feel like, okay, this doesn't seem like my kids got leukemia because this is hereditary. It feels like something else caused my kids to get sick that very likely is happening in my apartment. Like, how is it possible that both my kids got leukemia and the previous tenants who were in this unit also got leukemia? Like, there's no way. That's just coincidence. No way. And so Dmitry became absolutely obsessed with this idea that he was going to get to the bottom of whatever was going on inside of that apartment. And so over the next year, Dmitry made multiple serious efforts to get an inspector to come out and look at the apartment. He wanted them to check for a gas leak or toxic chemicals or something in the soil. But when he talked to building management, they just insisted that they'd already looked into all those things and everything was fine. Like this is just hereditary. It's just coincidental, drop it. But Dmitry couldn't let it go. And he kept pushing, asking anyone he could to just try to help him figure out if there's some external factor that's causing his family to become ill. But it all went nowhere. Basically, people just started ignoring his requests, and Dmitry felt like there was nothing he could do. By 1987, only a few years after Dmitry and his family had moved into Unit 85, Dmitry's older son passed away from leukemia, and Dmitry's younger son continued to get sicker. Meanwhile, a rumor began to spread around the apartment building and also just across the whole area that Unit 85 of that apartment building must be cursed. 2 years later, on a cold morning in 1989, Dmitry came home from the hospital where his younger son was being treated to grab some clean clothes for himself and his wife. He and his wife were now spending virtually all their time at the hospital. It felt like they were at this point just waiting for their second son to die. That was the direction this seemed to be going. And so, of course, this is like a really miserable, awful time for Dmitry and his wife. And so when he got back to his apartment and after he got those clothes, instead of just immediately leaving and rushing back to the hospital, which was just so awful, Dmitry just wandered into his son's bedroom and just took a minute for himself. He sat down on one of the beds and he stared at that decorative rug that was hanging on the wall, which had been there since the first day they had moved in. The sons had put it up there. And when he looked back at that day, he remembered how excited and how hopeful his sons had been and how he and his wife had been for their new life here. Like, this felt like such an amazing opportunity. But that day, that move-in day, felt like a lifetime ago. Ever since then, nothing had gone the way they had expected. And so Dmitry wondered if maybe the rumor was true, that Unit 85, where they lived, maybe it really was cursed. And while he was thinking about that, something on the rug, the decorative rug on the wall, caught his eye. And so Dmitry, he got up and he walked over to this rug to get a better look. And at first, he couldn't even tell what he was looking at. But upon closer inspection, he knew something was wrong here. And it was wrong enough that he actually ran out of the room, picked up the phone, and called emergency services. So when Dmitry had moved in, he'd been so excited that he'd basically overlooked a lot of red flags. He never asked why the previous tenants would leave behind such a great apartment. Like, he didn't know it was because they died after living there for a very short amount of time. But he didn't ask. And he also didn't ask about why basically everybody on the premises just seemed so sad and lifeless all the time. Like, everybody acted that way. He never asked about it. And so ultimately, Dmitry's opinion of this place, of Unit 85 in this building, is that, you know what, there can be nothing wrong with living here. I mean, this is a modern place. Everything's so new and beautiful. Like, it has to be a safe place to live, right? But it would turn out being brand new and modern was actually what made this apartment building so dangerous. When this building was constructed, the Soviet government had been in such a rush to show off how wonderful and rich the country was in time for the Moscow Olympics that they'd made a terrible mistake. During the construction of this whole apartment building, the crew had lost a very small but very important piece of equipment. It was a capsule on a machine that measured the density of soil, which they used at the quarry where they were carving the stone that was used to build the apartments. Now, work had been paused so the crew could find this capsule, but the government also really didn't want there to be a big delay here because they wanted to show off this amazing place, in time for the Olympics. So after a week, even though the capsule was still missing, they just called off the search and resumed construction, figuring the capsule must just be somewhere in the quarry. But the capsule was not in the quarry. It ended up embedded into the stone walls of Unit 85. And this was a big problem because that capsule contained a substance called cesium-137, which is extremely radioactive. And so for the next 8 years, the people who lived in that apartment building, in particular in and around Unit 85, were receiving constant radiation exposure. That's why all of Dmitry's neighbors seemed sad and pale and lethargic. And that's also why Dmitry's family and the family before him who had lived inside of Unit 85, it's why they got leukemia. Dmitry discovered the awful truth in 1989 when he was in his son's bedroom and he was looking at the rug hanging on the wall. What he noticed on the rug was there was what appeared to be a burn mark. And when he looked more closely, he realized that the burn was coming from the wall itself that the rug was pressed against. Like there was something in the wall causing this rug to burn. And so not really having any idea what that was, but knowing that, something odd has been going on here, he suspected for many years, and no one's really looked. This seems really odd. I better call the authorities. Well, when he did, the authorities came out and they inspected the apartment. And when they cut into that wall behind the rug, what did they find? The missing capsule. In total, 6 people who lived in this apartment building died, and 17 more were disabled, all because of the radiation in Unit 85. However, despite that being sort of hard facts, nobody was ever held accountable for this deadly incident. Our third and final story of today's episode is called A Bone to Pick. On the evening of September 17th, 1896, A detective named John White dug a shovel into the ground outside of a home in Evanston, Illinois. So Detective White worked for the Evanston police, and that morning, the owner of the home that he was currently digging in front of had come in to report that he had found bones buried on his property. So White had been sent out there to see if they were human or animal. Now, White had actually already stopped by the home earlier to inspect a few of the bones the homeowner had pulled out of the ground, and his initial thought was they were likely just from a deer or some other animal, so he was not expecting this to be human bones. However, he had still come back to fully excavate this yard because this property was only a quarter mile from the former home of the infamous serial killer named H.H. Holmes, who had been caught just 2 years earlier. And H.H. Holmes had confessed to 27 murders, but the police believed that there were dozens or even hundreds more that they didn't know about. So if any of the bones that were found on this property were human, it was then very likely they were connected to this serial killer. And that would be a huge find for Detective White at a time when he desperately needed a win. Because just a week ago, a reporter from the Chicago Chronicle had published a very unflattering story about Detective White, about how he had bungled a case, which had made White sort of like the laughingstock of the police force. It had been very embarrassing. But more than embarrassment, I mean, Detective White cared a lot about his reputation. He cared about being a good detective. So he had been looking for a way to sort of get that story out of everybody's heads. And he thought, like, what better way to do that than to be the detective that finds these missing bones, these potentially missing bones of these victims that had never been found. And so White, who he's out here, part of this bigger excavation of this property, he takes a shovel and he begins to dig. And at some point, he hits something hard in the ground. At that point, White took a shovel away and he reached down and he carefully brushed away the dirt from whatever he hit. And eventually, when he revealed what it was clearly bone, but more than that, it was clearly human bone. It was an entire human skull. And so White, he was thrilled. This is like, in some ways, the best thing he could have found. This is undeniably human remains here. And that was sort of what he was hoping he would find. And there also wasn't much decay or discoloration on the skull, which suggested it had not been buried for very long, at least not more than a few years, which also highly suggested it was connected to H.H. Holmes, who had been caught 2 years ago. And so White, he's feeling really good. Like he's got the big find here. This is exactly what he hoped would happen. He knew the medical examiner would obviously have to look things over and confirm some things, but it certainly seemed like he had effectively struck gold. And it also seemed like this was going to be White's chance to really stick it to that reporter who just a week earlier had written that horrible article about him. Now look at White. Look what he was doing now. Nobody would remember that terrible article, and everybody would remember this. And so White, he stops digging, he wraps the skull in a blanket, and he heads back to the police station. And when he went in there, who was already inside talking to another officer? None other than that very reporter who had written that embarrassing article about White a week earlier. And so White, he's thrilled. Like, this is the best case scenario for him. He's got that skull that's wrapped in a blanket. And he made a point of, as he walked down the middle of the aisle of this big room full of all the other officers and desks and this reporter, he made a point to really indicate that he had something important in his hands and he was walking with a purpose here. But he really wanted to get the reporter's attention. And so he walks down the aisle, he's got his skull, and the reporter, he notices and stops what he's doing. And he turns and he looks at White and he's like, "Hey, what do you got there?" And so White, he turns to this reporter and, he stares at him like, "I know who you are. I know what you wrote about me." But what he does is he unfurls the blanket and reveals the human skull to the reporter. And the reporter's looking at it like, "What in the world?" And White's like, "Yeah, he's kind of gloating as he's doing this. He's like, "Yeah, I was digging up over at that property about a quarter mile from where H.H. Holmes lived. And I think I found another victim, a victim that nobody knew about. Yep, here it is. So there you go." And the reporter, he's staring at the skull. He's hearing what Detective White has said. And White could see the gears are turning in the reporter's head. Like, this is a huge story. And the reporter's like, "Oh my goodness, like, thank you. I got to write about this. This is amazing. I can't believe you've found this. This is incredible." And so White's like, this is the greatest thing. He's going to write a new article. It's going to feature me. I'm going to be the hero. And also, how great is it that this article is going to be written by him? Like the same guy who talked bad about me is now going to make me out to be some kind of a hero. This is perfect. The next morning, when White walked into the police station, he was greeted with all his fellow officers cheering and clapping for him, congratulating him on this huge breakthrough, the find of this skull. So that Chicago Chronicle reporter had immediately written a story about White's big find, about finding the skull in that yard, and it had been front page news that morning. And so all of White's colleagues, everybody had read this story. He was the star. And to White's delight, the reporter even openly speculated that that skull might even belong to H.H. Holmes's former wife, Minnie Williams, who'd completely disappeared a few months after they had gotten married, which was a huge revelation because nobody knew what happened to her. And it was like, wow, Detective White, you figured it out. You found her. And so Detective White had like the best day of his life. Like, this is redemption. Everything is great. Until that night, on his way home from work, Detective White stopped at this very crowded newsstand to pick up a copy of the evening edition. He grabbed a newspaper off the shelf and he looked at the front page, and unsurprisingly, his story, the Bones story, was still very much front page news. But as he read through the article, his stomach dropped. And then he heard a noise coming from all around him that made his blood run cold. It would turn out, other than the human skull that White dug up on that property, all the other bones that so far had been found on that man's property had been horse bones. And more than that, the skull did not belong to a murder victim. So, unfortunately, White's big breakthrough was not a breakthrough at all. But Detective White, he actually knew that. He had known that from the first second he stepped on that property. Ever since that embarrassing article had been published about White that week earlier, he'd become obsessed, not just with fixing his reputation, but specifically with getting revenge on that reporter who wrote it. And this bone scenario had given him, in his mind, the perfect opportunity. He had come up with this elaborate plan to plant the human skull, pretend to find it, and then tell that specific reporter all about it, in hopes that the reporter would write a completely incorrect story and then get publicly humiliated, exactly the way White felt like he had been humiliated. But White had underestimated this reporter, because the reporter, after seeing the skull that White showed him and writing that big article about how this skull could be connected to H.H. Holmes, the reporter, he gets that story out the door that morning. It's this big hit. After that, on that same day, the reporter went to the medical examiner to ask for more information about the skull. And quickly, he learned about the other bones, and he learned that this skull very likely was not connected to H.H. Holmes. And the reporter began to see that this looked like a setup. He saw through White's scheme. And so that evening, a whole new article had come out about White and his big discovery. And basically what it said was White was a petty moron who tampered with evidence and thought he could pass off horse bones for human ones. And so White, after reading this story and realizing what a terrible position he was in now, that sound he heard all around him that made his blood run cold was the sound of the other people all around him reading this article and laughing at his expense.
On Monday, June 4th, 2012, 34-year-old Eric Samoa stood between two brand-new Jaguar cars on the showroom floor of a luxury car dealership in Bethesda, Maryland. Eric was talking to a potential new car buyer. Eric was this dealership's top salesperson, sometimes pulling in between $10,000 and $20,000 US in commission checks every month. Eric was very handsome. He wore a well-fitted black suit and a red tie, and he was tall with a shaved head, brown eyes, and a goatee. Eric smiled at his potential customer, told him a joke, and then put his hand on the guy's shoulder like they were old friends. But pretty quickly, Eric sensed this guy was not actually ready to buy a car just yet. Still though, Eric had not become the top salesperson at this dealership by giving up at the first sign that the customer is not fully committed. Instead, Eric just continued talking and listening to the guy, doing his best to establish a real connection. That way, when this guy came back and was ready to buy a car, he would hopefully come back to Eric. The potential customer walked around one of the Jaguars and told Eric he would definitely think about buying it. He said he loved how it looked, he just needed to talk to his wife first. Eric said he totally understood, and then he handed the guy his business card and walked him out of the showroom and said he looked forward to meeting with him again. Then Eric turned and walked back across the showroom floor, past all the polished, perfectly lit cars, into a bright carpeted hallway that led to the break room and a few offices. Eric walked into his manager's office and said he was taking off for the day. His manager told him to have a good night, and Eric just grinned, because he definitely had a good night planned, and he couldn't wait to get it started. About 15 minutes later, Eric pulled into the parking lot of his high-rise luxury apartment building in Silver City, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. The apartment building was the type of place that catered to young professionals, with a rooftop pool and plenty of bars and restaurants within walking distance. Eric walked into the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor, where his place was. Once inside his apartment, he went right to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. Then he headed to his bedroom and changed into black jeans and a black t-shirt, and then he walked out onto a small balcony. He left the door open behind him. Out on his balcony, Eric sipped his drink as he watched the local restaurants and bars down below come to life. Eric loved this part of town, and he loved his apartment, especially because he'd had to work so hard to be able to afford it. Eric was the youngest of 4 children born to immigrant parents from Ghana. And when Eric and his siblings were kids, their parents had told them that the United States was filled with opportunity, and that in the United States, they could be anything they wanted as long as they worked really hard. So Eric had grown up basically believing the American dream was true, that if he put in the work, he would be successful. And looking out from his balcony inside of his upscale neighborhood, Eric felt like he was definitely on the right path. Selling luxury cars had really paid off. He made great money, and he had no intention of slowing down. Just then, Eric heard a knock at his door. He turned around and walked through his apartment and put his glass down on the coffee table, then opened up the front door and saw a 34-year-old Katrina Ben standing there. Katrina smiled, got up on her toes, and threw her arms around Eric's neck and gave Eric a big kiss. Then they both went inside, and Katrina curled up on the brown leather couch in front of the TV, and Eric went to the kitchen to pour Katrina a glass of wine, and then he joined her on the couch. Eric and Katrina had been seeing each other for a few months, but they were still keeping things really casual. They had met outside of the apartment building and discovered right away they had a lot in common. Katrina shared Eric's really strong work ethic, and it's what allowed her to become a nurse. They also both loved basketball, and so their relationship consisted of basically hanging out a couple of times a week, watching a basketball game together, and then spending the night together. And that night in particular, they were both really excited because there was this big NBA playoff game on. And so, sitting on the couch, Eric and Katrina talked about who they thought was going to win the game, and then they also talked about how their jobs were going. But Eric looked a bit distracted. He kept picking up his phone and checking the time. Finally, he just turned and asked Katrina if she was up for going on a quick ride before the game started. Katrina figured he just wanted to go out and maybe pick up some food or something, but no, Eric told her he actually wanted to go meet a guy who he could buy marijuana from. He said the guy lived close and it wouldn't take very long. Katrina was surprised. She knew Eric occasionally smoked weed, but he'd never asked her to go buy weed with him. Still, she figured it wasn't that big of a deal. They were in a really nice suburb, so how dangerous could this weed dealer really be? So Katrina told him that was fine, as long as they got back in time for the start of the game. Eric promised they wouldn't miss a thing. Then he and Katrina left the apartment, went down the elevator, and out to Eric's car. After driving for a few minutes, Eric turned onto a side street in front of a small apartment complex, and he pulled over to the curb and put his car in park. To Katrina, the street seemed totally empty, but suddenly the back driver's side door opened, and this tall, skinny-looking drug dealer with a scraggly beard slid into the back seat. The dealer quickly handed a paper bag over the seat to Eric, and Eric took the bag, he looked inside, and he saw a Ziploc baggie of marijuana, and after he was satisfied, he handed the cash back to the dealer. The dealer then hopped out of the car without a word, closed the door, and disappeared back into the apartment complex. The entire exchange took less than a minute. Eric turned and smiled at Katrina, and then he turned the car back on, and he drove them back to his place just in time to watch the opening tip-off of the playoff game. And then later that night, after the game was over, Eric and Katrina went to bed together. Then, right before Katrina actually went to sleep, she reminded Eric that she had to work early the next day, so pretty likely when he woke up in the morning, she'd be gone. Eric said he totally remembered, then he kissed Katrina goodnight, and the couple rolled over and they both drifted off to sleep. And hours later, in the early morning of June 5th, 2012, Eric was still asleep in his bed when somebody walked into his bedroom, walked across the floor, and stood right beside him, staring down at him as he slept. The following day, so June 6th, Eric's manager at the luxury car dealership sat in his office trying to get a hold of Eric on the phone. Eric was supposed to work that day, but he hadn't shown up, and his phone kept going to voicemail. Top salespeople like Eric occasionally took what everybody at the dealership called unscheduled days off, but Eric always made sure to let his manager know if he wasn't going to come in, and he hadn't on this day. So the manager walked to the showroom floor and talked to a couple of other salespeople, but none of them had heard from Eric either. The manager started to get worried, so he went back to his office and he called Eric's emergency contact, who was one of his older sisters. The manager told Eric's sister he didn't want to upset her, but he hadn't seen or heard from Eric that day. Eric's sister was totally frightened by this, and she immediately called Eric, and when he didn't answer, she called her other sister and her other brother to see if they had heard from him. But they too had not talked to Eric in at least a couple of days. Eric's sister, the one who the car dealership manager had called, had a really uneasy feeling. Eric talked or texted with at least one of his siblings every single day, and so Eric's sister felt like, this was an actual emergency, and so she took a deep breath and dialed 911. After explaining what was going on with Eric, the 911 operator said that police would send officers by Eric's apartment to do a wellness check on him. Eric's sister thanked the dispatcher, and then she went right to her car and raced across town to Eric's apartment building. A little before 5 p.m., Eric's sister waited downstairs in the apartment complex lobby while a building manager led 2 police officers up to Eric's apartment on the 6th floor. One of the officers knocked on Eric's door but got no response, so the building manager unlocked the door and stepped back. At that point, the officers stepped forward, walked inside, and began calling out to see if anybody was home, but again, there was no answer. So the officers walked across the apartment, down a short hallway, and came to a closed bedroom door. One of the officers knocked, but there was still no answer, so they opened up the door and walked inside. And there was Eric laying in bed. There was a sheet that was pulled up all the way up to his mouth. The officers walked over, and they saw there was a single gunshot wound to Eric's head. Both officers thought it looked like Eric Samoa had taken his own life. The officers quickly went back downstairs, and when they got there, one of them placed his hand on Eric's sister's shoulder. He said he was so sorry, but they had found her brother deceased upstairs in his bed. Eric's sister let out a shriek that echoed off the lobby walls. She started wailing and crying. She could not believe her little brother was gone. About 45 minutes after Eric's body was discovered, Detective Dmitry Ruvin of the Montgomery County Police Department walked into the lobby of Eric's apartment building. He saw officers standing with 2 women and a man who were huddled together and crying. Ruvin was one of the youngest detectives on the force, but he did have experience, and other cops basically envied him for his seemingly boundless energy. He waved one of the officers over, and the officer told him the people in the lobby were Eric's siblings. Ruvin asked the officer to let them know that he would be down shortly to talk to them. Then Ruvin quickly walked across the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor. Ruvin walked through Eric's apartment, and he understood why the first officers on the scene had thought Eric killed himself. The door to the apartment had been locked when they arrived, and there was no sign of forced entry, and expensive items like Eric's computer and TV had been left untouched, so this didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Ruvin stepped into the bedroom, and he saw that Eric had a single bullet wound in his head, another sign of a possible suicide. But Ruvin searched the entire bedroom and didn't find a gun, so he knew the officers had been wrong. There was no way Eric had shot himself. Someone clearly had shot him. Ruvin looked down at Eric's body, and for whatever reason, he felt this instant connection with the guy. He couldn't really explain it. He'd worked a lot of homicide cases, and he always felt sympathy for the victims. But this was something different. This was more personal. Reuven told himself that the reason for this connection must just be because Eric looked to be about the same age as Reuven. It was like, here's this guy with every opportunity in front of him, and somebody took that away from him. And this just made Reuven really upset and angry. It just seems so wrong. Reuven took out his phone and called the station to let his boss know that this was a homicide, not a suicide, and so he would need an investigative team sent over. And not long after that call, forensics analysts arrived at Eric's apartment and began sweeping through it. And they would discover a single .380 caliber bullet casing in the bedroom, but there still was no sign of a gun anywhere. They also did a sweep of the apartment for fingerprints and possible DNA samples, but they knew that type of evidence might not get them very far in this case. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of struggle meant there was a good chance Eric knew his killer. So the analysts figured they would just find lots of prints of friends or family who were often at Eric's place and so were not suspicious, and any of them could be guilty. And Reuven knew right now 3 of Eric's family members, his sisters and brother, were down in the lobby waiting to talk to him. So Reuven let the forensics team continue their work, and then he headed back downstairs. The elevator doors opened, and Reuven could hear Eric's siblings still crying in the lobby. Reuven walked slowly now, and he heard the sound of his shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He hated this part of the job. Eric's siblings only knew that their brother had been found dead in his apartment. They didn't know what happened. So Reuven lowered his head and approached them, and he told them he was so sorry, but their brother had actually been murdered. That sent Eric's brother and sisters into another fit of screaming. Detective Reuven stood with them and let them get as loud and as angry as they wanted. Then eventually, one of Eric's sisters caught her breath and wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked right at Reuven, and she told him he needed to speak with a woman named Denise Harrington. Reuven asked who Denise was. Eric's sister said Denise was Eric's girlfriend, and she was no good. She was 20 years older than Eric, and his entire family knew Denise was just using Eric for his money. Reuven thanked Eric's siblings for their time, and he said police would follow up with them soon. Then he offered his condolences again and headed back upstairs. When he got there, he could tell, after hours and hours of searching this apartment, really the only thing investigators had found so far was just that bullet casing. But Reuven felt like this Denise person was a really strong lead, and so it didn't really matter right now that they didn't have much evidence. So Reuven found the phone number for Eric's girlfriend, Denise, gave her a call, and when she picked up, he told her he needed to meet with her to ask some questions about her boyfriend. The day after Eric's body was discovered, members of Reuven's team re-interviewed Eric's brother and sisters and looked into other family members who might have spent time at Eric's apartment. But Reuven himself remained focused on Eric's girlfriend, Denise. At the station, he led Denise into an interview room, sat across from her at a small wooden table, and handed her a bottle of water. He thanked Denise for coming in, and then asked her if she understood why she was there. And she just said, I understand there's some questions about Eric. Reuven nodded, and then asked her very gently if she knew that Eric had been killed. A look of total shock came across Denise's face, and she just began shaking her head, no, and then just said she couldn't believe it. People loved Eric. Reuven watched Denise very closely. She looked genuinely surprised and upset about this news, but he knew some people were naturally just very good actors. Looking at Denise now, it also struck Reuven how big the age gap was between her and Eric. Eric's family clearly had not approved of a woman 20 years older dating their little brother, but Reuven did not think being older than Eric somehow made Denise more suspicious. Reuven asked Denise if it was strange that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in the last couple of days, before he was killed, but she told him it was not strange that she hadn't heard from Eric because Eric was actually not her boyfriend. Not anymore, anyways. Reuven was confused. Eric's siblings seemed very certain that Denise was seeing Eric and using Eric as far as they were concerned, but Denise explained that she and Eric had hit a rough patch about a month earlier. She found out he was obviously cheating on her when she noticed text messages coming into his phone from 2 other women. And so Denise just did not want to be treated that way, and so she had ended it with Eric, like their relationship was done and she had not talked to him in a while. And Denise said, if somebody close to Eric thought that she, Denise, and Eric were still together, it was probably only because Eric had not told anybody about the breakup. Denise felt like, Eric likely wanted his family to think he was settling down and not still going out and seeing a bunch of different women at the same time. Finally, Reuven asked Denise where she was on the night of the murder, and she said she'd been at home and said police could check her phone records that would prove she was telling the truth. Reuven thanked her for her cooperation and said he would be taking her phone now so they could download the information to help corroborate her alibi. And a little later that day, after police had finished downloading the information from her phone, Reuven gave the phone back and let Denise go. And while Reuven did think Denise was genuinely shocked when she heard the news about Eric, he couldn't help but think, Denise had a clear motive to want to harm Eric. Eric was cheating on her, and a jilted lover almost always had to be considered a viable suspect. But for now, Reuven would just have to wait until his team went through all of that information downloaded off Denise's phone to figure out if she really was a viable suspect. So in the meantime, Reuven headed back up to the 6th floor of Eric's apartment building to talk to some of Eric's neighbors. Reuven knocked on a door that was nearby Eric's apartment, and a guy in his 20s answered. The young man did not look surprised to see a detective standing there. He said he knew Eric pretty well, and he knew Eric had been killed. Then, without being prompted, he told Reuven the police should really question Eric's girlfriend. Reuven said he'd already met with Denise, but the young man just kind of stared at him, and then he said no, Eric's girlfriend's name was not Denise, it was Katrina. If you recall, Katrina was the woman who watched basketball with him on the night he was killed. The neighbor told Reuven that Katrina lived in the apartment building, and he had seen Eric with Katrina a bunch of times. Reuven thanked the young man for his help, and then the door shut, and then Reuven just stood there in the hall thinking. Denise had mentioned during her interview that 2 women had been texting Eric, which is how she had figured out he was cheating on her, but neither of those 2 women were named Katrina. And Eric's family had never mentioned anybody named Katrina at all. And so now, Reuven thought he might have a jilted lover in Denise and a secret lover in Katrina to consider as suspects. Reuven really wanted to make sure he was fully prepared before he brought in Katrina for an interview, so he and his team did some digging. They found out Katrina was from Mississippi, and she had come to Maryland a few months earlier to work as a nurse for the National Institutes of Health, a government organization focused on public health research. But much more important than that, at least to Detective Reuven, was that several people in the apartment building saw Eric and Katrina together on the night before Eric was killed. A couple of days after Eric was killed, Detective Reuven found himself back in an interview room talking to a woman he thought was Eric's girlfriend. And just like he had done with Denise, he started the interview by asking Katrina if she knew why she was there. And Katrina, who had a sort of confused look on her face, told him that, she understood she was here to help with some investigation, but she hadn't been given any more details than that. She figured it might have something to do with where she worked, but she didn't know. At this point, Reuven told her point blank that her boyfriend, Eric, had been found murdered in his apartment, and that she was the last person anybody had seen him with. Immediately, a look of complete disbelief came across her face, and as she pulled her legs up onto her seat and grabbed her knees with her arms and began rocking back and forth, she began saying to Reuven that, why would anybody want to do this? Everybody loves Eric. And then she asked Reuven, is it possible that this was not Eric? But Reuven said no, this was definitely Eric, and he is definitely deceased. At this, Katrina clutched her knees even tighter, and then she looked up at Reuven with a very sad look on her face, and she said, she just felt so guilty. For the past couple of days, she'd been furious at Eric because he had not been responding to any of her text messages. And so she thought he was just being a jerk for some reason, but now she knew why he wasn't responding. It was because he was dead. That realization was like too much for Katrina to handle, and for a minute, it seemed like she might have a total breakdown. But then she stopped rocking in her chair, and she put her feet on the floor, and she leaned forward. It was like something had just clicked in her mind. She told Reuven that something really strange had happened on that last night that she was with Eric. Reuven leaned in and asked Katrina to please walk him through everything she could remember about that night. Katrina took a deep breath, and then she began speaking. She said she and Eric had met up to watch basketball, but they left his apartment so Eric could go buy some weed. Then, after Eric got his weed, the couple went back to Eric's apartment, they watched the game, they had sex, and then they went to sleep. None of this seemed very out of the ordinary to Reuven, and he was about to say as much, but Katrina said, "Hold on, the weird part happened the next morning." She said the next morning when she woke up around 5 a.m., because she had to get up really early for work, she had looked over and Eric was not in the bed. Then she heard voices coming from some other room. She thought maybe Eric was on the phone, so she just got dressed, grabbed her things, and walked out of the bedroom, and the drug dealer who had sold Eric the marijuana the night before was standing right there. Katrina said this totally freaked her out. Doing, a quick weed deal in the car was one thing, but having a drug dealer in the apartment at 5 a.m. seemed wrong to her. And being a nurse for a government organization, she did not want to be associated with any drug dealers. But that wasn't all. Katrina said when she looked at this dealer, this tall, skinny guy with a scraggly beard, he seemed really agitated. And when Katrina told Eric she was leaving, the dealer turned and looked at her and walked over, grabbed her arm, and basically rushed her out of the apartment and then shut the door behind her. Reuven got Katrina to give him as many details as she could about the dealer and about the location where he had sold Eric marijuana the night before, and after taking all that down, Reuven stopped for a second because he thought of something. He asked Katrina, why didn't you check in on Eric later in the day or really at any point over the next couple of days when he wasn't responding to her text messages? Like the last thing you saw was Eric alone in his apartment with this sketchy drug dealer who rushes you out the door and shuts the door behind you. You said the drug dealer seemed agitated, so what? You just figured everything was fine and you just didn't think to follow up? Katrina could see how suspicious it seemed, but she explained to Reuven that her relationship with Eric was very casual. They basically were not a girlfriend and boyfriend, they were not a couple, they were just kind of hooking up periodically, and that was it. And so Katrina said, she just was worried that if she really aggressively followed up trying to get in touch with Eric and, went over to his place to check on him, that might come off to Eric like she was this really obsessed girlfriend, and she just didn't want that. And then over the course of a couple of days, when Eric did not get in touch with her, she got mad at him. Why is he not getting in touch with her? And so it just kind of led to this silence. Reuven nodded and then thanked Katrina for coming in and told her he would be in touch if he needed more information from her. Not long after Katrina left, Reuven's team worked to track down that drug dealer. And with Katrina's description of him and the exact location of where Eric purchased that marijuana from him, it didn't take them very long to find this guy. His name was William Woodfork, and he quickly became the focus of Reuven's investigation. A couple of days after the interview with Katrina, Reuven sat back down inside the interview room with William Woodfork. William was tall and lanky with a patchy beard, just like Katrina had described, and he was very, very nervous seeming. He was having a really hard time sitting still. Police had not told William why he was here, and so Reuven figured William was likely very worried about getting busted for dealing drugs. But Reuven acted like he didn't notice, and he just casually reached into a folder and pulled out a photo of Eric, and he placed it on the table in front of William, and he said to William, "This man right here in this photo is a guy named Eric, and he was just murdered." And then Reuven asked William, "How long have you known Eric?" William looked down at the photo, and after staring for a second, he just shook his head and said he'd never met the guy. Reuven smiled a very knowing smile and then told William it was not a good idea to be lying to the police. This is a homicide investigation. This is about as serious as it gets. Reuven told William he had Eric's phone records, so he knew William had texted Eric the night before Eric got murdered. Immediately, William hung his head and stared at the floor and then began backtracking. He admitted to Reuven that actually he had sold Eric weed a few times, including on that past Monday night. At this point, Reuven stopped smiling, and he immediately asked William, "Okay, fine, you sold him weed on Monday. Why did you go to Eric's apartment early on Tuesday morning at around 5 a.m.? William immediately looked up and told Reuven he was not some big-time drug dealer out settling scores. He's like, "I had nothing to do with Eric getting killed." But Reuven was not about to take the word of someone who had literally just lied to his face. And with the phone records and William admitting he saw Eric the night before the murder, Reuven felt like he had more than enough evidence to pursue this lead further. So not long after that meeting, Reuven secured a warrant to search William's apartment. And when they did search his apartment in the week following Eric's murder, police would find a .380 caliber handgun, the same type of handgun that had been used to kill Eric. And so Detective Reuven was pretty much positive he had just found Eric's killer. But later that week, when the ballistics report on Williams' gun came back, it showed the ammunition used in his gun did not match the bullet casing that was found in Eric's bedroom. meaning this gun was not the murder weapon. Reuven was not willing to totally eliminate William as a suspect. It just seemed too coincidental that this guy would happen to have a .380 caliber handgun in his apartment, but it could be just a bizarre coincidence. And without more compelling evidence, he knew any case brought against William would not hold up in court. And so suddenly, Reuven felt like this investigation had just stalled in a major way. Investigators went from believing they had their killer right back to having no idea who they were even looking for. And at the same time, Reuven began getting daily calls from Eric's sisters, but he had no new information to share with them. And Reuven told other investigators that he felt like he was letting Eric's family down. Weeks passed without any new leads coming in, and then several months went by, and pretty soon this case became much less of a priority for the department. But Reuven refused to let the case just go cold. In fact, he put a photo of Eric on his desk to remind him of the job he still needed to do. And he continued to talk to Eric's sisters almost every day, and he promised them as long as he was on the force, he would never stop looking for their brother's killer. In May of 2013, almost a year after Eric's murder, Detective Reuven continued his investigation. But almost no new evidence had surfaced, and so he was basically running out of ideas. Reuven pored over Eric's case files whenever he could, looking for anything that he might have just overlooked. And there was one piece of evidence, or really a missing piece of evidence, that had always bothered him. The gun that had been used to kill Eric had never been found. So now, Reuven decided to try something he knew was a total long shot, but he felt like he had nothing to lose. Police often confiscated guns as evidence in investigations, and they occasionally received guns that people had simply found and turned into them. So, Reuven reached out to every police department in the county and asked for a list of all the .380 caliber handguns they had received in the past year, either confiscated as evidence or turned into them by a Good Samaritan. The other departments all cooperated, and soon Reuven ended up with this list of 60 .380 caliber handguns. And then Reuven began the painstaking work of tracking down the history of each of those 60 guns. And the first 58 guns led him nowhere. But when he began looking into the 59th gun on the list, he thought he might have found something promising. That gun had been found discarded on the side of the road on the Capitol Beltway, one of the busiest streets in Washington, D.C. The man who had handed this gun over to police had been sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic and just happened to look over and see the gun lying on the side of the road. And that spot on the Beltway was not very far from Eric's apartment. But there was another detail in this report about this 59th gun that gave Reuven the biggest jolt of energy he'd felt in almost a year. The man who found this gun had found it just 2 days after Eric's murder. Using the 59th gun's serial number, Detective Reuven tracked down the weapon's original owner, but that man told Reuven he'd actually sold the gun at a pawn shop years earlier, and so Reuven found that pawn shop and got their sales records for the gun, and from there, Reuven started tracking down every one of the gun's previous owners, and there were quite a few of them. And this process dragged on for weeks and weeks, but finally, right around the actual 1-year anniversary of Eric's death, Reuven talked to a man who had sold this 59th gun to a pawn shop just a few months before Eric was killed. And so Reuven felt like there was a legitimate chance that whoever had bought the gun from this latest pawn shop was the killer. Now, the pawn shop was nowhere near Reuven's police station, but he decided he would take a trip there, hoping all of his work would pay off. So, on a hot and humid June day, Detective Reuven, along with several other officers, walked into the pawn shop on the outskirts of a small rural town. Reuven thought it was the kind of place someone would never find unless they already knew it existed. The pawn shop owner greeted Reuven from behind the counter in a very thick southern drawl, and he asked how he could help. Reuven told the owner he was looking for sales records on a particular gun, and then he gave the owner the serial number of the gun. But the owner right away just sighed and said he was really sorry, but he couldn't do that. He'd stored those sales records in diaper boxes out in a shed behind the shop, and earlier that year, rats had gotten into the shed and started gnawing away at all the diaper boxes. The owner was worried he would lose the records to the rats, and he knew losing gun sale records could get him in big trouble with the federal government, so he handed over all those records inside of the chewed-up diaper boxes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF. The ATF is a United States government agency that primarily monitors firearms trafficking. Reuven just stood there and stared at the pawn shop owner. He felt like laughing at how absurd this was. He never imagined diaper boxes and rats would play a role in his homicide investigation, but here he was. And so ultimately, Reuven thanked the owner and then left the pawn shop and headed back to Montgomery County, Maryland, to the police station. And once he got there, he called an ATF agent that he knew and told him what had happened. Reuven offered to go to ATF storage and personally dig through all the chewed-up diaper boxes himself, but the agent assured him the ATF would find whatever he needed. And on June 12, 2013, so over a year after Eric's murder, Reuven got a call at his desk from that ATF agent. And the agent told Reuven that they had just tracked down all those diaper boxes, and they had found the specific report Reuven was looking for, and so he was faxing the report over right now. Reuven thanked the agent and hung up the phone, but as soon as he did, he felt so nervous. It was like every muscle in his body was getting tense. He knew if this report that he was about to read didn't give him any new information, he would have no idea what to do next. And so as he was thinking about this, he looked over at the photo of Eric on his desk and just held his breath. The fax machine near his desk started printing out the report. Reuven got up, walked over to the machine, grabbed the report, and began to read through it. And as he did, Reuven felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. After more than a year of investigating this case and weeks of tracking down gun owners all over the place, Reuven knew, based on this report, that he could call Eric's siblings right now and tell them he had found their brother's killer. Based on records from the ATF and evidence collected over the course of a year, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Samoa in the early morning hours of June 5th, 2012. The killer was standing at the foot of Eric's bed, watching him sleep. They'd been standing there for a few minutes, just staring, but they knew now it was time to act. So they reached into their bag that was slung over their shoulder and pulled out a .380 caliber handgun. The killer then walked forward until they were right next to Eric, trying to be as quiet as possible. They didn't know what Eric would do if he suddenly woke up. And so at this point, the killer kind of leaned over Eric until they were so close to him they could actually feel Eric's breath on their cheek. Then they slowly pulled up their gun and aimed it basically point blank at Eric's forehead, and then they fired. The bullet lodged inside of Eric's brain, and he died without ever waking up. The killer quickly tossed the gun into their bag and then pulled the bedsheet up to Eric's mouth to try to cover up some of the blood. Then the killer ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them. They opened up the front door, they locked the doorknob, and then closed it, and then they ran down the hallway to the elevator. As the elevator was making its way down, the killer took several steadying breaths, doing their best to look as calm as possible. When the elevator doors opened, the killer walked across the lobby, went out to the parking lot, got in their car, and began driving towards Washington, D.C. Now, it was still dark out, and the killer saw headlights up ahead from a line of cars driving towards the city, and so since they didn't want to get caught in traffic, the killer just hit the gas and whipped down the road. The killer reached the Capitol Beltway in D.C. before traffic got too bad, and at this point, they rolled their window down, reached into their bag in the passenger seat, grabbed the murder weapon, and threw it out the window. The first chance they had, the killer turned around and sped back across the Maryland border. About 30 minutes after fleeing Eric's apartment, the killer walked back into Eric's apartment building, except this time, when they got in the elevator, they did not go up to the 6th floor. They went up to a lower floor. And then once they got to that floor, they got out of the elevator, walked down the hall, and went inside of their own apartment. And once they were inside, they showered, put on a nurse's uniform, and went right back downstairs to go to work. Katrina Ben, Eric's basketball-loving, casual romantic partner, was Eric's killer. It would turn out Katrina wanted a lot more out of her relationship with Eric. She did not like the idea of it being casual. And the week before the murder, Eric had blown off Katrina on a night they were supposed to hook up. Katrina knew Eric was out with actually another woman, and she told him she was not okay with that. But Eric was just not ready to be in a fully committed relationship with Katrina. In fact, he didn't even want his family to meet her. So Katrina started to feel like Eric was only using her for sex, and it made her really angry. So angry that she decided she would kill him. When Katrina first arrived at Eric's apartment to watch the basketball game, she had the gun with her, but she just wasn't sure if this night was going to be the night that she actually followed through. But Eric's impromptu drug deal gave Katrina potential cover. She could make up a story and say the dealer had shown up at Eric's apartment and seemed really suspicious, and basically make it seem like the drug dealer had killed Eric. However, the dealer, William Woodfork, had nothing to do with the murder. He had never even been to Eric's apartment. It took Detective Reuven tracking down the gun that was used to kill Eric and delving into the gun's history to finally discover Katrina was the killer, because he had traced the gun back to a pawn shop in a small rural town in Mississippi that just happened to be Katrina's hometown. Now, at this point, Reuven was very sure Katrina was the killer. However, he needed a receipt that showed she was the one who bought this gun last. But when he went to the pawn shop in Mississippi, those sales records were in that shed getting destroyed by rats, and so they had been shipped to the ATF. But Reuven was able to get those records from the ATF, and as soon as he looked through them, he saw right there Katrina's name was on the record. She had bought the murder weapon. She definitely was the killer. And so Katrina would be arrested at her parents' house in Mississippi, and she would be found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 20 years with no chance for parole. To this day, Eric's family say it was Reuven's patience and determination that ultimately got justice for their little brother and gave the family some sense of closure.
Like nights would never change. You said we're just being honest, while I was building names. I held on to small moments, like they could make you stay. But loving you felt borrowed, like sunlight in the shade. You smiled when I got closer, then stepped just out of reach. I kept pretending distance was something I could beat. We were almost stars, yeah, we got so close.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are This